The summer I turned 16 and got my license, Kyle Lewis was pulled dead from the lake. It was the week before Christmas and heat pressed down over the town. People went to the lake to cool off, but Kyle didn't drown. There was no water in his lungs. Coming back now, 10 years passed. Like always when I returned to visit my parents, I found myself slowing down when I reached the lake. The turn-off was on the long road which led to their house and then on into town, and I felt myself pulled toward it, as if a magnet lay in the deep center of it, drawing me. I stopped and got out the car and stood there on the side of the road, looking out toward the water, the shimmer of sun on the still surface. The memories rushed back at me. The evenings my father and I spent out in the garage working on the car he'd bought for us to do up together. My sister sobbing at our table and my mother comforting her while my father stood silent. The long days of summer and the police and the rumors people whispered to one another. The swagger of the Ryan brothers around town. And the last day of Kyle's life, recounted to police by those who'd seen him. That day he'd slept until 11. He and my sister Taylor had been up late drinking the night before, and when they woke the empty bottles and glasses were still on the bench, the smell of booze hung in the air of their little house. They lived on the same long road as my parents did, but further into town. I passed their house each day when I biked home from school, dreaming of the day my car would finally be ready for me. Kyle was hungover and he sat on the couch and rolled a cigarette while Taylor made them coffee. She asked him if he wanted anything to eat and he said no, he wasn't hungry. He was quiet and she knew he was worried. He was worried because he owed Dean Ryan and his brother Pete money, and they were getting impatient. When told this, the police wanted to know what he owed them for. Taylor said he bought some car parts off Pete Ryan and hadn't paid him yet, but eventually she told them the truth. By then he'd been found and lay cold in the morgue, and she wasn't worried anymore about what might happen to him. It already had. Kyle drank his coffee and smoked 2 cigarettes one after the other, then he showered and pulled on the jeans and navy t-shirt he would die in. He told her he was going to visit a friend and drove out the way he always did, tires squealing, sending up a cloud of dust which hung in the still air. At the Mobile on the corner, he pulled in to buy more cigarettes and an energy drink. While he was stood there at the counter, Pete Ryan walked in and came up behind him. "I'm coming to collect today," Pete said. That was what the cashier heard him say, and she didn't know what it meant. She said Kyle didn't reply, or if he did, she didn't hear it. Or maybe she knew more, just like we all knew more, and didn't want to get on the wrong side of the Ryan brothers. My dad had gone to high school with them both, in the same year as Dean, who was the oldest, and he said even back then they were raising hell all over town, making a name for themselves. After Kyle left the Mobile, he came to ask my father for money. When he pulled in, Dad and I were out in the garage, tightening the brakes in the car. We'd spent the last 6 months working on it. Just like he'd promised it would be. Now that I could drive, it was almost ready. Kyle got out and my dad looked at him, something cold coming over his expression. He stood silent and waited. "Can we talk?" Kyle asked him. They headed inside to the kitchen. A minute later I followed and sidled up to the door, stood silent, hardly breathing. Dad was standing against the bench with his arms folded, Kyle in front of him with desperation sliding off him. "Please, I wouldn't ask you if I had anyone else to go to. I swear to God, I'll pay you back. I just owe Pete for this car I bought off him." Quote. My father cut him off with a hard laugh. "That piece of shit you're driving's not worth $500, let alone $5,000. You come here begging me for money, at least have the guts not to lie about why." A liar was one of the things my father despised most. Almost as much as he did a man who would hit a woman. My sister's boyfriend was both those things. "All right, but it's not what it sounds like," Kyle said, his tone thin and pleading. A way I'd never heard him speak to my sister. For her he'd never crawled. "I sold some pot for them, and I owe them money from it. It was only a one-time thing, I just got to get square with them." It was a version of the story I'd heard, which was that he'd been selling a long time for them. And he'd only skimmed a small amount, but they'd added interest. Dad stood up straight from the bench, and even though he was the same size as Kyle, he seemed to loom over him. "You want me to fix your mess now? What sort of man are you?" It was a question both asked and answered in his scathing tone. "A liar. A coward. The worst kind."